Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Lucas. I'm Professor of Learning at the University of Winchester and proud to be chair of the English Project. The English Project promotes awareness and understanding of the unfolding global story of the English language in all of its varieties, past, present, and future. Our big idea is to create the first ever permanent museum for the English language in England here in Winchester. And I'm pleased to say we're making significant progress with this ambitious goal with our friends at the Hampshire Cultural Trust. Today's lecture is one of a series of English Project Heritage Open Day lectures in partnership with the University of Winchester, exploring the English language in English counties. In previous years, we've looked at Hampshire and Yorkshire. Today, we examine Staffordshire. Next year, we'll be looking at Kent, and beyond that, the County of London. Our speaker is fellow English Project trustee, Christopher Mulvey. Chris is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Winchester, where he is also managing editor of the Winchester University Press. Chris taught in the United States from 1963 to 1978, and here in Winchester at the university from 1980 to 2007, specializing in 19th century English literature, American studies, and African American culture. A fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts, Chris is a prolific author, including, in terms of this evening's talk, co-authoring A History of English in 100 Places. His title tonight is Why Potter's Accent is Different from Her Majesty's, the English Language in Staffordshire. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all of you who are listening. The English language in Staffordshire, or why the Potter's accent differs from Her Majesty's, or from Mercian English to modern English. They've got three titles there, but it's all the same lecture. And I take a starting point will be 1066. I take that point because the English counties, as we now, as they were first identified and sorted by the Norman administrators, and they give us what are called the historic counties of England, and there are 48 of them. They don't, Staffordshire, historic Staffordshire is not the same as modern Staffordshire, because for instance, in 1910, the 5 cities of the potteries were extracted from the county. I'm going to include the Stoke-on-Trent towns because they're so important in the discussion of linguistics. So when you're talking about really history and culture, we need to work with the historic counties. Now, that's what I'm going to do with focusing this year on Staffordshire. A county I'm not going to be focusing on, and yet I could lecture on it quite a lot, I think, is a county called Tamworthshire. And I'm not going to be talking about Tamworthshire because it was never created. And why it wasn't created and why I'm talking about Staffordshire is part of the story. It's a small part of English history, but it's actually quite a great part of the history of the English language. Now, Staffordshire, or Tamworthshire, if it were to exist, it's the heartland of the Mercian dialect. And I say the Mercian dialect because it's one of the 4 great dialects of Old English. Old English dialects we name going from north to south as Northumbrian, Mercian, West Saxon, and Kentish. Actually, there were probably as many as 30 different dialects in Old England. That's in the period from the year, should we say, 500 to 1300. But only 4 of the dialects resulted in manuscripts. So that's why we constantly talk about these great dialects. They resulted in manuscripts because they were the focal points of kingdoms. And the kings began, once they became Christian, to order their monks to write down their laws, not in Latin, or they probably wanted them in Latin, but to ask them to write them down in English. And the monks would then, being in the same neighborhood as the king, would use the king's English. So there were 4 kings and 4 kings' Englishes, we might say. Now, the group I want to focus on are the Mercians and the Mercian dialects, and that will ask us to look at the not the Jutes, not the Saxons, but the Angles. And that'll take us back. Now, we move back from 1066 to, should we say 450? 450 is a kind of traditional date at which we say the West Germanic peoples on the eastern western coast of the North Sea, so with the eastern coast of the North Sea, in what we now call Scandinavia and North Germany and Denmark, those West Germanics had begun to see that the Romans had gone in 410 and they probably weren't coming back. It was safe, therefore, to move across the North Sea and the Channel and set up and invade and set up their own settlements. And they did that from 450 onwards. As the Angles, if you look at your map, and we've got a picture of a map, but I can hold it up. Useless. Coming across from the area called Angolan, they made towards the Humber. And as they entered the Humber, the great estuary, the huge estuary of the Humber, some of them went up the Ouse and the Don and created the kingdom eventually of Northumberland. But others went into the Trent Valley, in the River Trent, and they then eventually created the kingdom of Mercia. And those are the people we're interested in. At a date which we really can't establish, there was a man, a legendary man, perhaps called Weorth, and Weorth led his peoples along across the North Sea, through the Humber, through the Trent, into the river that we now call the River Tame. And he settled at a convenient spot on the River Tame. And so we had a settlement that was Tame Weorth, where Weorth was on the Tame, which then became the name Tamworth. Significant because it grew to become the central focus point of the kingdom of Mercia. Now, how great was Mercia? Why don't we know enough about it? Well, we're beginning to know a bit more about it because of amazing find in the 2009, so recently, when a metal detection person hit on the greatest discovery of treasure in the British Isles ever, I think. It came to be called, you may remember it, it was in the newspapers, the Staffordshire hoard. It was 6 kilos of gold and silver, 4 kilos of gold. Wonderful objects which have been smashed to bits, so they're in 4,000 pieces, but they're being pieced together, and they show the most exquisite jewelry, the most exquisite metal craft, the most sophisticated artistic design. And it's given a shock to everybody. Say, this was a really extraordinary kingdom, and they produced extraordinary materials. One of the reasons we don't know about them is that there are so few records of the Mercians. They are scanty remains, says William Walter Skeat. We have almost no, we have some manuscripts, but we don't have the kind of rich treasure of manuscripts that we've got from in Northumbrian, or above all in West Saxon. So in a way, this great hoard sort of shook people and say, wow. And the great kings you might have heard of, one of them you will have heard of, I'm sure. There's King Penda, and it's in Penda's time, around about 660, that we think all this gold and silver was buried. And his, I guess, grandson, descendant, was King Offa, who was the great Mercian king of the, a great Mercian king of the 7th century, or the 8th century, I beg your pardon. Now, what we're looking at here is a constant struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes for dominance. And in the year 500, we can say, well, there weren't any kingdoms, but by the year 600, there were 7 kingdoms, and famously it's called the Heptarchy. And then at the time we're talking about around about 700, 800, it dissolved into 4 strong kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Kent, and Wessex, the kingdoms from which we have the manuscripts. The drive was towards one kingship, one king, which would be the King of England. And that was really the first person to call it, who rightly called himself the King of the English, if not King of England, is Alfred the Great of West Saxons. But what they were fighting over was dominance, and the great prize in all of this was London. If you could get hold of London, you didn't necessarily have to live in it, but you could tax it and become very, very wealthy. Now, in the year 700, Mercia was on top, and it was dominating from the Humber to the Thames, for the Welsh mountains to the North Sea. And its southern border was the Thames, and where it came up against the West Saxons. And though it didn't defeat the West Saxons, it kept them in check. And to keep them in check, it seized the town of Cookham, where there was a great abbey. And when King Offa died, his wife, Sinathrith, retired to Cookham, and became the abbess, and she took vows. I don't suppose she studied the Holy Book too much, but she was immediately made abbess. And in that way, she secured Cookham for her son, Egfrith, who'd now become king of the Mercians. And with that angle from Cookham is 130 miles from Tamworth going south. And just as importantly, it's 30 miles from London. This enabled the Mercians to get control of what they wanted to be controlled of. And also it meant that you found Mercian being spoken, particularly along the Thames, Berkshire and Middlesex. Well, Mercia didn't last forever, and no kingdom perhaps really does. And by 800, the West Saxons, Wessex as we might call it, had become dominant. They first reduced the East, they'd already reduced the Kentish peoples. They now reduced the East Saxons, and there was a kingdom of East Saxon. It was called Essex. It's now become a county. And their capital city was London, but they drove them out of London. Then they faced and then they subdued the kingdom of Mercia. But the West Saxons were facing a much greater threat than either the East Saxons or the Mercians. They were facing the Danes. The Danes had been raiding in earlier years, but by 850 they had arrived with a great army, and they were disarming. They were not raiding; they were invading. They were meaning to settle. Now, the king who held them at bay but couldn't drive them out was King Alfred of the West Saxons. And Alfred came to a compromise with the Danes and the King Guthrum of the Danes. And his compromise was a complicated one. He allowed them to keep their section of England. And that was starting from London, not south of the Thames at all, but starting at London with a boundary which more or less followed Watling Street going up towards Cheshire in a northwest direction, divided England in half. And in that section to the right, as it were, looking at it, or to the east, the Danes would be in control and Dane law would prevail. To the west of it, the English would be in control and English law would prevail. That territory actually came to be called in time the Danelaw. Alfred really lost London, which was the big prize, but as a compromise or whatever, he insisted that Guthrum became a Christian. And more than that, he insisted that all the Danes who were now settling in the counties from Northumberland and actually from the river Firth all the way down to London, to the Thames on the east side there, all those counties, he insisted that all the Danes should become Christians, which, by the way, they seemed willing to do, because it's rather like joining the European Union. Once you joined in, you got good trading relationships, you could intermarry, and you could make a lot of money. The intermarrying was very important. It was very important for the kings and queens and princes, but it was even more important for the language, because there were, in the Danelaw, many homes in which you would have a Dane and an Angle. The Dane will be speaking Norse, which is a North Germanic language, and the Anglo will be speaking Mercian, which is a West Germanic language. They're pretty close. I mean, Daddy might call it a skirt, and Mummy might call it a shirt. Daddy might call it a church, Mummy might call it a kirk. And we can see in our language now a fusion of words which are shared out between English and Danish, between Norse and Mercian. The children took on at least 1,000, 2,000, maybe many more words. They also took on grammatical forms, the way we shape a sentence by saying, I am here or am I here, reversing to get a sentence. They remarkably took some pronouns from Norse. She, they, them, you'll recognize them. So we got then a development of a change, and this began to make quite an impact upon Mercian, because now you can realize that Mercian was split in half. You had East Mercian and West Mercian. Tamworth was unfortunately on the wrong side of the line. It fell into Danelaw, and so it was no longer a capital city of Mercia or even of any significance. Once Tamworth was famous for kings, now it's famous for pigs. A Tamworth pig, I'm told, is a very fine pig. To the west, we had the remnant of Mercia, and King Alfred had subdued it, and he'd forbidden them to call themselves kings and queens. What he did allow them was to call themselves Lord of the Mercians and Lady of the Mercians. And there's only one Lord of the Mercians. He was the son of the last king, and Alfred married him to Alfred's daughter, Ethelred. Ethelred, the husband, Lord of the Mercians, died in 911. And Ethelflad was a pretty fantastic person, and she continued to rule. And she told the Mercians that they no longer had Tamworth. They should choose Stafford as their central city. And so Stafford becomes into history. When she died in, I think, 919, it petered on for a while, but then around about 950, all of Mercia was dissolved, became a collection of shires, and they created a new shire called Staffordshire. That's why we have Staffordshire and not Tamworthshire. Well, with that Christianizing of the Danes and the Danish influence on English, we get the first big changes in Mercian and the first division of Mercian in what we might call West Mercian and East Mercian. Now 1066 again, French invades the English language. I'm not so interested in the Normans invading the country, but the Norman French invading English, so much so that, unlike in Mercia, English was completely subdued by French, and for 300 years, the major writing was either in Latin or in French. Very little is written in English. It never disappears, but it just is completely subdued. Meanwhile, you have a culture of clerics who are fluent in Latin, fluent in French, and often fluent in English. And if they're not fluent in English, they don't need to be, but if they're not fluent in French, they learn it. And so you have these men, and they all are men who are working in the scriptoria, working in the three languages. And here you get a really strange thing or phenomena. By 1350, English begins to return. More and more records are written in English. And what kind of English are they writing it in? Well, it's a very, very different English from Mercian or even West Saxon. All of the dialects have changed. And a huge change has taken place in Mercian. We can give a rough count of the words in Old English because Bosworth and Toller, two great scholars of the 19th century, collected all the words from every manuscript that exists. And it amounts to 10,000 words. That's head words, that is. So the verb to be, which has got about 50 words, and it counts as one word. So 10,000 words. But if you did a dictionary of the English language in 1400, you'd have to add in another 10,000 words, all of which would be coming from French, although ultimately the French words were coming from Latin. So there's a huge change. French has massively invaded English, even more than Danish did. And It has changed the grammar once again of English, subject, verb, object, pattern completely standardized for sentences. We don't have Germanic order of sentences with the verb always coming at the end. Also, the masculine, feminine, neuter of nouns disappears in the grammatical form, and English has now got logical, what's called logical gender for its nouns. So somebody who's male is male, and something that's actually female is female, but all the objects in my study here are neuter, and that makes English actually quite easy to learn, I think, for outsiders, though I don't know. I never really learned it, I suppose, not in that way. What we have is a new vocabulary and a new grammar, probably a new spellings. What we have now is a very unusual language with Middle English. We could call it a fusion of a Germanic Italic fusion. Old English is a Germanic language, Norman French is an Italic language, and they come together in a quite remarkable way. Now, the earlier division, there's once again, Mercian starts dividing. Before we talked about a geographical division with that boundary between Danelaw and English and England. It was pretty permeable, people could cross it, but linguistically, Danish invades on the Mercian to the east of Watling Street and trickles in on the western side. But now we got another division, and that's between the English Mercian being spoken up there in Staffordshire and the Mercian that's being developed and spoken down there in Berkshire and Middlesex. Because where was the French language invading the English language most dramatically? Well, in some respects, in the written language. And the great center of writing in English in the 13th, 14th centuries was Chancery. The king had the exchequer had up to 120 or 30 clerks, writing letters patent and writing documents and writing on behalf of the king, writs and what have you. They will be writing them in Latin and English and in French. And in that Chancery, you got a real huge infusion of French into that language. And this would be part of the cultivation. In the other area where French invades is in the marketplace, with English traders having French-speaking customers. So it's not entirely an intellectual activity, but it's very much focused upon the Chancery. And the officers of Chancery, because they had a standardized Latin and they had a standardized French, they start to standardize English. Particularly, they start to conform spellings. Now we come to a very significant book in the way that I'm talking and probably the way you're talking. 1473, a book was printed called The Histories of Troy. It's the very first book printed in English. And it's quite a remarkable book. It wasn't actually printed in England, it was printed in Belgium because a Kentish man who was a businessman had gone across to Northern Europe and Flanders and Belgium and what have you. And there he discovered that people were printing books. Don't forget the first printing press is what, 1464. So there he is in 1473, learnt the trade, printed his book. And this man, whom you know, of course, is William Caxton. I think in 2 years later, 1475, he crosses the channel, goes back to England, sets up a printing press. Now, where did he set it up? In London, where is all the money? No, he didn't. He set it up in Westminster. And what language did he, what dialect did he choose? Did he translate the French book, The Histories of Troy, which was originally French? Did he translate it into Kentish? No, he didn't, because nobody was writing in Kentish anymore. Did he translate it into the language of the Londoners who could have afforded it and were educated? East Saxon? No, he didn't, because East Saxon, as far as we know, had never been used in written form. He chose the language of Chancery, which was the southern version of Mercian English. He also chose the spellings of Chancery, and though those have been pretty good, pretty accurate, it's called an isomorphic fit when your sounds fit your letters. It wasn't too bad in 1400. It had been bashed around by French monks a bit. So a lovely word like queen, originally spelled C-W-E-N, comes up now as Q-U-E-E-N. But less than that, the Chancery had frozen its spellings around about the year 1400. And what then happened in the next 70 years was a massive change in the way the English pronounced their words. It's called the Great Vowel Shift. And Caxton noticed it because he'd been abroad and he came back and he said, well, when I first started out, things sounded like this. Now it sounds like that. And he thought that the English were rather odd and changed their speech. But in point of fact, he's one of the first people to notice that language constantly shifts. And he noticed it because he had to make choices in how he would spell things. So we're stuck with a medieval spelling, but there you go. It's not too bad, actually. Now, in the 17th century, scholars had another look at the English language, and they looked at the language that was coming out of the printing presses of London, and they said, this is not good enough. We've got to change the grammar. Now, making the choice of a dialect was a serious, obvious one. Making the choice of spellings an obvious one. What was wrong with the grammar? Why do they want to change that? Well, they wanted to change it because the first grammars in the English language had begun to appear at the time of Shakespeare, about 1570. And what they did really was to take Latin grammars and just transpose, or not exactly, but translate them, transpose them, transform them into English grammars. And then they found that the English did terrible things, like ending their sentences with prepositions, using double negatives, not to cancel, but to inform. I ain't got no money. It doesn't mean I haven't got any money. It means, well, whatever it does mean. They use double comparatives like more, better. They split infinitives, and they had dangling modifiers. Well, you can't do any of those things in Latin. You seem to be able to do them in English, but they said that you shouldn't do them in English. And they gave us those 5 extraordinary rules, which was rather bent English out of shape. Remember, it's a Germanic language, not an Italic language. Anyway, that's what's happened, and that's what we live with. Now I want to move to another very significant book in the 18th century, 1755. Dr. Johnson produced a dictionary in which he gave us 42,773 spellings with definitions, a brilliant magisterial dictionary. He was pretty much sorted things out. There are 1 or 2 words that he actually spelled quite differently in different parts in his dictionary. But he gave us the spellings. He also gave us definitions. And in his introduction, he confirmed those new grammatical rules in his essay on the English grammar. And one thing he didn't do, though, he said, I will not, I'll give you a definition, I'll give you spellings, I'll give you grammar, but I will not give you pronunciations because words are pronounced differently throughout England. Well, that was 1755. If we jump forward now to a much less significant book, not up there with the Histories of Troy by Caxton and the Dictionary by Johnson, a novel by Maria Edgeworth, 1812, called The Absentee Landlord, which is about Irish aristocracy and on one hand, and their behavior in London, and their meeting up with English aristocracy. And she has some wonderful upper class ladies, Mrs. Derville and Lady Langdale, and they're talking about this Irish woman, who's actually an aristocrat herself, called Lady Clonbrony, and they say they absolutely mocking the way she speaks. And they say, and I'm going to read you a bit of what Mrs. Derville says. She imitates Lady Clonbrony. You can't conceive the pains she takes to talk of the tables and the chairs, and to thank you with so much taste to speak pure English, said Mrs. Derville. Pure Cockney, you mean, said Lady Langdale. Now that different distinction those 2 women make is quite extraordinary. Well, maybe not. It's one of the things that people do. Because Lady Clonbury is not talking Cockney. She's obviously talking with an Irish accent, but what those two women mean, there's one proper way of speaking, that's pure English, and all the rest is pure Cockney. So now, Lady Clonbury, that's, you know, it's been fixed. Johnson didn't know about this. She does know about it in 1812. Lady Langdale's way of speaking had spread right across England by 1900, but it hadn't spread down, it had spread across at the top level of the aristocracy, and they were all talking in the same way, in an accent that we now call public school accent. And why do we call it a public school accent? Well, let's go to see what was happening in Parliament in 1868. 7 schools had approached Parliament and said, look, we're fed up with all these poor boys we've got to educate. We want to educate rich boys. And so an act of Parliament was passed through, passed through Parliament and approved and signed off by Queen Victoria. And it's actually called the Public Schools Act. The 7 public schools, well, you might well know them. They're in alphabetical order, though they probably are other ways of ordering them. Charterhouse, Eton, Harrow, Rugby, Shrewsbury, Westminster, and Winchester. Now, all those public schools, as they were calling themselves then, remained being called public schools, although they were now effectively private schools, because although they took their 20 or 30 poor boys, they were pushing in 1,000 rich boys. And they, by a creative ambiguity, they were called either the great schools or the public schools. And so it was by, with the tremendous expansion of the number of public schools. I mentioned just the 7 great, they're called the great schools, but there are probably 100 of these private schools throughout England. And when you sent your child to that school, you wanted him, and these were boys' schools, you wanted him to speak proper, you wanted him to speak tough, and you wanted him to speak posh. The trick there was you had to get schoolmasters who usually came from poor backgrounds. Oxford and Cambridge, through the Dons, everybody began to, in this upper educational echelon, speak with public school accents. In the 20th century, mid-20th century, people weren't too happy with this. Linguists had never been happy with the phrase public school accent, and they came up with a notion of received standard English, received standard grammar, received pronunciation. But in the middle 1950s, a linguist called Alan Ross detected a slight shift in the received standard pronunciation, that there was an upper crust way of talking, which he called upper received practice, received pronunciation, URP. A sort of minor figure on the edge of aristocracy, Nancy Mitford, a great writer and a novelist and the sister of a fascist, she took this up and she said upper received pronunciation. She didn't use the word lower. She divided English into English pronunciation in England, we're not talking about anywhere else really, into U and non-U. And that became the designation of upper received pronunciation and ordinary English. What I'm talking is called General British English. And that's my kind of accent is what is used now, because the Oxford English Dictionary, for its 600,000 words, gives pronunciation guides. It's decided to elect, and what's elected is the educated speech of people who come from the home counties. There are about 21 million of us who speak like this. This is not the, I would say, get out of my house, but Nancy Mitford and Lady Langdale will say, get out of my house, you binder. But I've distracted myself there. Let me say now, you're asking, what's this got to do with Staffordshire? Well, quite a lot. All these different forms of English have emerged from Mercian English. And when we want to analyze the Staffordshire's pronunciation, there are 22 million people there, and I haven't been to Staffordshire for a long time. What I'm going to do as a rule of thumb is the guidelines I'm getting from the Department of Education for England and Wales. they tell me that 6% of children go to private schools or fee-paying schools and stay on till the age of 18. 64% of children go to what in England we would call state schools, in America would be called public schools, free state schools, and they stay on post the age of 16. And 30% of children go to state schools and leave at the age of 16. Now, this gives us 3 ways of talking English. Whether it should do or doesn't, what the morals of this is, I don't know. But those private school children, the 6%, end up with upper received pronunciation. The 64% get standard regional, and then the 30% get regional dialect. And what I mean by standard regional is that those people going to school until 18 and probably onto universities will use the Johnsonian grammar, standard English grammar, obeying the 5 rules, above all, not using double negatives. That's a real giveaway. Whereas the regional dialect persons will leave school uncontaminated by Johnsonian grammar. When we look at Staffordshire, we go back there, we will find that there will be about 600,000 people in Staffordshire with a regional accent with regional grammar. There'll be 1.25 million of standard grammar with a regional accent, and there will be possibly 100,000, I think it might be more like 60,000, but following the figures, of people in Staffordshire who talk with URP, upper received pronunciation. Let's take the Wolseys of Wolsey Hall. The Wolseys have lived in that on the estate, if not the hall, since the 11th century, when the king, Eric, I think the Peaceful, gave to Edric de Wellesley an estate. And the Wellesley now pronounce their name Wolsey, and they've lived there ever since. Eric de Wellesley sounds as though he might be speaking French, but his descendants would have spoken Mercian. But once the division came in, they would have started to, they were on the west side of Watling Street, would be West Midlands English. But once the 19th century came, they started to send their children to the public schools, of course. They would now be speaking received pronunciation, upper received pronunciation. And Edric is a name that stayed in the family. So Edric Wolsey, and Edric means rich and powerful, and that's this accent is the rich and powerful accent. Now, what about the other people in Staffordshire? Let's go to the Potteries, Stoke-on-Trent. Now, the Potteries are 6 towns, it is not 5, sorry about that. Burslem, Fenton, Hanley, Longton, Stoke, and Tonstal. They are combined in 1910 into the city of Stoke-on-Trent. The great thing about Stoke is its clay. And with the clay, you can make pots. The finest pots in England have been made in that area of Staffordshire since Roman times. And the people, they call those 6 towns the Potteries. They call themselves potters, and they call their dialect Potteries. Lovely name. Now, it seems to me we've had one great Staffordshire hoard, the gold and silver of the museum, but you've got gold and silver sounds in the streets of Stoke-upon-Trent. I'm going to try and imitate it. It's going to be hopeless, but I'll do my best. But after this, you can go to Google and Google these 3 words, Potteries Dialect YouTube, and it'll take you to a series of videos made in Stoke-upon-Trent. It's called Me and My Language. Me meaning me and my language. You will hear a potter declare that his potteries, meaning his speech, his potteries is his identity. I can't really imitate him. If you take the accent and the dialect away, he says, you just become a non-entity. Now, 90% of the potters are locally born, and in their voices can be heard an English unaffected by Johnsonian grammar, an English far removed from Westminster and the Queen's speech. But I'm going to give you some treasures from the streets of Stoke. if a Stokey says to you, or a Potter says to you, Binya, it means how are you? I'll hit you on the bosco. I'll hit you on the mouth. She's balmy on a crumpet, not all there. Hey up, all out, all right. Hello, how are you? Are you okay? Let's try a few more. Do go to the website because I'm making a mess of this. How at youth? How are you, my friend? 9 inches, 9 inches, 9 inches. Neck 8 dine, drink it fast. Us off, go away. Let's skip the next bit because I'm not sure how much time I got left. Bill, how much time?
You've got 10 minutes.
Oh, good. I'm keeping that. Right. So a long time ago, the Queen and the Potters spoke exactly the same English. But by those divisions, first of all, the division of Mercia into a west side and an east side, then the invasion of the Danish and the Danish language, and then the division sort of north and south by this East Midlands accent being developed, or dialect being developed so extensively in Chancery, and then taken over by the printers, then bent out of shape by the scholars of the 17th century, and then standardized pretty thoroughly by the lexicographers of the 18th century, and then beaten into schoolboys by the schoolmasters of the 19th century, and then broadcast by the BBC in the 20th century. This ends up with very, very different ways of speaking. Now, one of the things about the Heritage Open Day in Winchester is that we're meant to have an emphasis on food. Well, language is not all about food, but when you're talking about food, you've got to use language. And I'm going to take a few words to focus on what I'm going to rather loosely call 3 kinds of English that you're going to get in Staffordshire today. I'm going to be a little bit alliterative. I'm going to call it potteries, proper, and posh. Proper is a terrible word. It's like correct. We simply don't use it in linguists, but I think you know what I mean. That would be the sort of a person who has regular grammar and does not, or she does not, he does not use double negatives. So in potteries English, you get a word oughts. And oughts is the food not eaten at one meal, but served at the next. In proper English, or in proper, oughts are called leftovers. And in posh English, there's no such thing. Now, oughts has a very full entry in the Oxford English Dictionary with a quotation from a love poem by D.H. Lawrence. And he is, of course, on the east side of the boundary of Mercian. And then the 2 lines of the poems are this: "Then what art collyfuggling for? I'm not having your oughts and slats." Now, oughts, we know the meaning of that because it means leftover food. It doesn't sound very loving, this love poem, but that's rather like, that's D.H. Lawrence all over. Slats is not in the Oxford English Dictionary, but it turns out to mean wet leftovers. So let's have another try. In potteries, fried potatoes are called fried frogs. In proper, fried potatoes are called fried potatoes. In posh, fried frogs are gronwy-friet. Now, in potteries, we have a phrase, scratching cake. It's a cake made of flour and lard. In proper, a cake made of flour and lard is called a cake made of flour and lard. In posh, a cake made of flour and lard is revolting. In potteries, to side the dishes is to remove the dishes. In proper, you clear the table. In posh, you leave it to the servants. In potteries, a smite is a mite. In proper, a mite is a morsel. In posh, a mite is not something a person expects to see. In potteries, you eat with your skeedy paw. That's to eat with your left hand. In proper, you eat with your left hand so that you can hold a book in your right hand. In posh, you eat with both hands. In potteries, a sword or sward is a rind of bacon. In proper, a rind of bacon is a rind of bacon. In posh, a sword was an ancestor's weapon of choice. In potteries, daddy's barn is where children are told they come from. In proper, children are told the facts of life. In posh, daddy's barn is where the wheat is stored. Well, I can't go on because I haven't got any more potteries in me, but I'd like to refer you to May and my language on the videos, and I'll thank you very much for listening. Bill, over to you.
Chris, wonderful. Thanks very much. A very compelling lecture with wonderful mimicry. The ability to get the European Union to talk about Mercia is quite terrific. Now, we have a few questions for you, and I have a few questions for you. Let's start with one from Deborah, which is a personal one. Where is home for you in terms of your language, Chris?
Well, I'm speaking general. What was that term I had to use? General British English. I'm from the home counties, and I come from Surrey, and I passed the 11 plus. So my language is home. Another name for it is home counties English, and those are the counties that ring London. London's not included in this because London is so mixed. And it has so many of upper class speakers, and it has so many Cockney speakers. When I talk about the county of London, we bring it all together. But in counties like, and I went to school 70 years ago, and then we were taught to talk properly. My parents had been taught to talk properly. Those terms, proper and correct, are really quite, they're very class-based and they're very privilege-based. But my accent is, I think, a standard general British English, the accent on which the Oxford Dictionary bases its pronunciations. Because when I listen to the pronunciations, they seem to be saying the words more or less as I would say them. So I have actually brought up in Kew Gardens in the Royal Borough of Richmond upon Thames in Kew Gardens. I lived there until I until I went to university. After university, I went to America for 15 years. And people sometimes say to me, did you go to Australia? Do you come from Canada? I think if I lived in New York, and I would say New York City now with a D rather than New York City with a T. So everybody, your accent gets affected, changed.
Thanks, Chris. And a couple of one historical and one linguistic question. Charlotte asks, when did French stop having the verb at the end of the sentence? You talked a little bit about sentence order.
Well, I'm not sure that it ever did. I mean, French is a language not unlike English in the sense that the Franks were Germanic speakers and they switched to speaking Latin. And so French emerged out of Germanic peoples taking on board Latin and evolved a version of Latin, which is the least Italic. As English is the least Germanic of Germanic languages, French is the least Italic of Italic languages. I don't think the French ever had it was German that had the verb at the end of the word, and in Anglo-Saxon that's often the case, because if you're working with case endings, you can put the words in any order you like. The sense becomes clear, and you can use word order for all sorts of tricks of emphasis.
Perfect. And Eric wondering about the role of Repton as a capital of Mercia. Wondered whether there was anything there that you might want to add.
Oh dear me!
It could be a very detailed trick question, so I don't know.
I've no idea. I mean, in all the reading, I thought preparing this lecture would take me 6 months. It took me 18 months, and I have to confess that in the all the explorations that I did, Repton didn't come up. I'd be interested to know. I'll look into it. I'm sure that they speak the most wonderfully varied English in the most glorious ways in Repton.
Splendid. Well, I know that question came from Eric Bodger, and he's hugely enjoyed your lecture. So perhaps Eric could answer our question for us, and I'll relay it. Thanks for those of you who are using the chat or the Q&A function. Do please continue to do that. Thank you for those of you who've put the English project web address in the chat. And just a reminder, I have put, and I'm putting in right now, the date of the English Language Day lecture, where we have slang expert Jonathan Green engagingly and amusingly challenging us to think about what that says about us as human beings. Deborah Briggs asks, are we to understand, Chris, that the regional Potteries accent is the most pure of the remaining Mercian dialect?
No, well, we won't use the word pure.
I thought you might not go for that. Pure or proper, or the P's are out.
Well, that's a very interesting question there. Is Potteries the closest we have to the original Mercian dialect? I would say that's possibly that it is. It's not, I mean, it's immensely changed. The idea, you know, that dialects freeze, they don't freeze, they evolve steadily. But some dialects evolve more rapidly than others, and the dialects start to evolve rapidly when they come into huge political, social, or other kinds of change and revolution. Such as the invasion of the Danes or the invasion of the French languages here makes huge changes in the way we speak, or indeed the invention of printing. But in a sense, in that northwest portion of Staffordshire and then moving into Shropshire, it's quite possible that the linguistic change has been the slowest that one might expect. And in that respect, one of the words they use is canst, meaning can you, and canst is actually an Old English second person singular. So yes, it might well be, we can't say they're speaking, it's not Mercian they're speaking, but it's much closer to Mercian than the way I speak.
Chris, when you were summarising why there is this difference between the language of the potters and the potteries, and indeed what we speak now, you talked about the West-East division, the North-South division, invasions, scholars, dictionary makers, schoolmasters, the BBC. You didn't mention Shakespeare, and I just wondered where Shakespeare and the West Midlands fits into the story.
Well, Shakespeare fits into it very neatly. And I deliberately avoided, if you like, literary references here because they're not necessarily affecting the general speech of populations. Shakespeare, very interesting indeed, because of course he is, because he's the greatest writer. Nonetheless, linguistically speaking, he comes from Warwickshire, and Warwickshire is to, if you like, the far west of the of West Midlands English, and his English has a very distinct Warwickshire quality. 19th century scholars used to pick up what they called Warwickshireisms in his language. And his language is quite an old-fashioned one. When he arrives in London, and you'll notice that he will he has two ways of doing verbs, third-person singulars. He can say he runs, or he will say he runneth. He runs is the sort of Danish or the Norse formula, and that's what's become dominant. If I said he runneth, it would be totally archaic. Shakespeare alternates, and I think and for him both are equal, because he probably at home would say he runneth, which is and you get the same actually in West Saxon. But when he got to London, he found that's not common at all. And he alternates often just because he wants the scansion, if he wants the extra syllable, or he doesn't want it. So with Shakespeare, you have somebody who obviously made quite a lot of alterations in the way that he wrote his language. It would be very wonderful to hear him speak. And I have David Crystal's son, Ben, does good Shakespeare imitations, and it does sound a little bit like Wurzel Gummidge.
I love it. The very wonderful Eric Bodger has answered his own question, and I share it. Repton was the site of a major battle with the Danes, who won, and I think that secured the position of Tamworth as uncontested capital. Thanks very much for that, Eric. Got a nice question here, taking you back to your American past, Chris. Do you think British English, in whatever form, will be increasingly influenced by the media, especially for entertainment, like series and movies using predominantly American English? And is that obviously happening now?
Oh yes, this has been happening really since I guess since Hollywood. There's a huge, is among English intellectuals and I mean English upper classes, an enormous resistance to American English. But in the general population, there is an affection for American English, and it's been widely adopted. When we talk about English as the major, the world global language, we're really talking about it, the American English version of it. And we talked about this a great deal in the English project, but people have to choose when they go to, I mean, when foreign people have to choose a language, they mock us English people because we don't know what language to choose. It's always obvious to nowadays for any foreign person, if they're going to learn a language, the language they need to learn or will have to learn is English. But the English they're learning is probably American English. And that thing in the long run, that's going to have a huge influence. I mean, when I was young, a billion meant, now what did it mean? It meant 1,000,000 million, not 1,000 million. But the American usage is 1,000 million. And when you use the word billion now, you mean 1,000 million. You don't mean what we now call a trillion. So all the time, the influence of it, first of all, I say the films, when the talkies came in, what was that, 1927, then of course people began to hear American English and they were delighted by it. Nowadays, a lot of English movies that go on in America have to have subtitles, but I don't think any American movie would require subtitles in England. We used to say in the 1950s, we are the Greeks to their Romans, which is rather a condescending, but also pathetic way of looking at it.
There's a nice little, there's some nice riffing going on the American idea. First of all, we have Linda from Chicago listening to you. Sad that she can't come to the slang lecture because it's actually in person. You're right, Linda. We'll do our best to record that. And we've got Deborah saying there are small American kids speaking like Peppa Pig now, which is quite nice, kind of reverse influence.
Yes, that's true.
Which is quite nice, isn't it? And then here's another question. Do you think text language will change the way we write and books are written, like you becoming you before now and be for, etc.? Do you think there's a shift there going on that's going to be a lasting one?
No, I think not, because there's always been a kind of texting going on. I mean, texting before texting, you've got words like okay, and nobody knows what the origin of okay is, except it means okay. And okay is okay, but you wouldn't, I don't think anybody, normally people wouldn't put it in a letter, or it's always got to be seen, to sense to be heard. No, I think that there's one of the great things that's emerged over the last 500 years is the standard English, and really written English is pretty much uniform right around the world, and it's quite difficult. The only thing that gives it away is coming from America normally is some spellings. There's only about 350 spellings that are different, but they're so commonplace that it makes the page look very different. But there's a kind of universal form of writing, because language has got two impulses. One is to separate out, as we've seen in how Mercian separates out into about 5 or 6 different forms. But and that's because people are out of contact with each other. On the other hand, and that's a centrifugal force, there's also a centripetal force. People have got to understand each other. So I think that texting is fine, but I really can't see anybody seriously, and I have to live another 100 years to find this out, spelling you and not you. No, it doesn't happen a lot.
Very good. We love you to live another 100 years and possibly to speak for another 100 hours, but we're very close to the end of this splendid lecture. I just want to end with one question, which is, you spoke with some passion about your investigation of the potteries, and I think I heard you saying that it was quite a lot to do with identity, that you'd located in the passion with which people were using their language. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yes, I think that you hear these people; they seem to be very keen to talk on in the videos. They are very proud of the way they speak, and the way that people speak is intensely identified with their sense of identity. And you can see that with Lady Langdale and Mrs. Derville. This is our way of talking, and this woman is a fake. She's an intruder, and this is what Nancy Mitford is talking about. One of the reasons they emphasized you and non-you in the 1950s was that the aristocracy had become poverty-stricken, and the only way it could demonstrate that it was aristocratic was saying, "I'd like to, get out of my house." And if you did that with a proper accent, with a real accent and not the phony one I've just used, it showed that you were of the real. It's what in the Bible they talk about a shibboleth, and a shibboleth is a word that can only be pronounced by true Israeli, by true Jewish people. And so they were able to just ask people to say this word, and if you got it right, you were admitted to the promised land, and if you didn't get it right, you were kicked out. Accents are terribly important to our identities. I suppose with my commonplace accent, 21 million, it's the largest accent group in the United Kingdom. It's only matched by the even greater 60 million people who speak, I forget what it's called now, but the language of Henry Fonda. Go and listen to Henry Fonda, and he is speaking in a beautiful voice, which is the accent of the largest accent group in the world. And when the Chinese reform their spelling, and they'll have to base it on Henry Fonda's English, not mine.
Chris, thank you so very, very much. Deborah Millard sums up what many of us are thinking. Fabulous talk. Really want to listen to it again. Thank you for 18 months research. And Becky and colleagues at the Heritage Open Days have put in the chat the place where you can go and do just that, listen to it again, where you can find out more about us, and where you can sign up for the very splendid organization that is Heritage Open Days. Chris, thank you so much. And wherever you are listening to this and watching this, please give Chris a very loud, but to him possibly inaudible thank you. I'll give him an audible clapping and applause. Chris, thank you so much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much too, and thank you all for listening. It's just been wonderful to talk to you.